This is Terrence R.J. Banks with Information Age Financial Solutions, coming to you with an incredible article I read from the New York Times, actually putting things in perspective of how much the recession is actually we're in right now. I would call it another Greater Depression, is how it's affecting cities. And it goes into real detail about and shows graphs in different areas of concern, and just breaks down just a lot of different facts that we need to be really paying attention to, especially if you live in one of these states or any of the states, because things are dramatically changing. As always, I'm going to put a link inside the description. I'm going to dive right in. The recession is about to slam cities, not just the blue state ones. Those with budgets that rely heavily on tourism, sales tax, or direct state assistance will face particular distress. Again, it starts off with a chart here: Rochester, New York; Buffalo, New York, because they're less severe; Detroit, New York City. Two Democratic senators. They put in the Republican, as is always political at that point. Each state is fiscally standard city, covering municipal budgets, but also revenues to other government and entities providing city services to school sewer districts. And they give the estimates where it's come from. The coronavirus recession eroded city budgets in many insidious ways. It will slash the casino revenues that Detroit relies on. It will squeeze the state aid that is a lifeblood to Rochester and Buffalo in upstate New York. It will cut the sales tax revenue in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where a healthy government depends on people buying things. We are a consumption society. The crisis has arrived faster than the damage from the Great Recession ever did, and it will cut deep in the fiscal year ahead, with many communities likely to lose 10% or more of their revenue they would have to see without the pandemic, according to new analysis. That's enough for residents to experience short-staffed libraries, strained parks departments, and fewer road projects. The hardest hit cities like Rochester and Buffalo could face 20% losses. And they show that here. That's why they have them on top. Interesting. I'll look at that at your leisure. The Great Recession was a story of long, drawn-out fiscal pain. This is sharper, said Howard Chernick, a professor emeritus of economics at Hunter College and a graduate center of the city of University of New York, who worked on a new analysis estimating revenue shortfalls for 150 major cities across the nation. These numbers give a sense of the possible economic pain for cities if Congress and the White House fail to agree on a new relief package that includes aid to state and local governments. It also rebuts some of the prevailing largely Republican arguments that have stalled those negotiations that federal help will bail out only blue cities and those that mismanaged their finances. Again, about that. Many cities facing steep losses are in the states represented by Republican senators like Florida or Louisiana, and analysis found little relationship between whether a place was fiscally healthy before the pandemic and the most dire projections of revenue shortfalls. And look like trust, they get a picture of it. Heavily state aid already has deferred millions of dollars of non-essential expenses. What matters most in this pandemic moment is how a city generates money. And that's a very good point. Those highly depend on tourism, on direct state aid, or on a volatile state sales tax will hurt the most. Cities like Boston, which rely heavily on the most stable revenue property taxes, are in the strongest position for now. The estimates to be published in the National Tax Journal from Mr. Chernick, David Copeland at Georgia State University, and Andrew Rashofsky at the University of Wisconsin, are based on the mix of local revenue sources, the importance of state aid, and the composition of jobs and wages in each city. The researchers predict average revenue shortfalls in the 2021 fiscal year of about 5.5% in the less severe scenario, or 9% in the more severe one. These are still high numbers. 5.5% doesn't seem like a lot. When it comes to budgeting the state budget, I can imagine it's a great toll. These projections cover not just municipal budgets, also every local government entity that spends money on services to residents in a given city, including counties and sewer or school districts. Those budgets are adjusted for the share of residents who live within city borders. And the pandemic has worsened in many parts of the country this summer. The researchers now believe their severe forecasts are more likely. The cities that rely the cities that rely on more volatile revenue sources will hurt more. They talked about this here: federal aid, student aid. 150 large cities. Look at this: Boston, Rochester, Miami, Florida, New Orleans. Some of the most vulnerable cities are like those like Rochester that rely heavily on state aid, will also likely to shrink as it did in the Great Recession. Rochester had already has already deferred millions of dollars of non-essential expenses like new uniforms or fire trucks. It furloughed or reduced the hours of about 1 in 10 city workers, many of whom will return if the city reopens further. Officials delayed an incoming class of new police recruits and canceled a new class of firefighters. We can't produce money. We can't borrow our way out of this. We can't tax our way out of this, Mayor Lovely Warren said. But our residents expect that the trash will be picked up on a trash day. They expect that the snow will be plowed when it snows. They expect that when they call 911 that a police officer will show up. Very good points. Here we go. For Washington, the reality it hurts. It's wrong to punish the victim, she added. The city here is the victim. Other city officials said the country said they have tried to plan prudently for downtimes, but the pandemic has brought added costs while state laws have limited their ability to raise revenue. Interesting. This is really what the federal government was built to do, to handle these events that are bigger than the borders of a city and bigger than the borders of a state, said Dave Massaron, the chief financial officer of the city of Detroit. In Detroit, 1/5 of the municipal budget typically comes from casino revenue, and casinos have only just reopened at reduced capacity. The city manages to save money when its recreation centers closed, and it hasn't spent as much as usual managing downtown traffic. This coming year, the city will also mow the grass less often. I'm sorry. This coming year, the city will also mow the grass less often on vacant properties it owns. With such moves, officials believe they will be able to get through fiscal year 2021 with a balanced budget. But after that, the decisions will get harder, especially without federal help. The city needs only to look back into its past to understand what happens when you have a structural imbalance and you don't have a way of addressing, Mr. Massaron said before Detroit exited bankruptcy in 2015. This is only 5 years later. They just exited stuff. Response times average 18 minutes. All 65,000 streetlights needed replacing. Other cities heavily depend on sales tax. Felt the implosion of this economy more immediately than cities that count on income or property taxes. Revenue from income taxes will lag behind. Unemployment, property taxes are set a year or two in advance. Consumer spending, particularly by the biggest spenders, dropped sharply early in the pandemic and expected to fall now for millions of workers who added 600 federal unemployment benefits expired at the end of July. Broad shifts in how Americans eat during the pandemic have affected tax receipts as well. Restaurants' meals are taxed, but in most states, the groceries people come at home are not. In Colorado Springs, which relies heavily on sales tax, those revenues plummeted in late March and April, but they crept back in May. And to everyone's surprise, the city saw slightly more in sales tax revenues in June than it did in June of last year. Mayor John Suthers attributes that to the resilience of local military and defense sectors and to all online shopping residents have been doing. Whatever. They just increased the tax in some way. Thanks to a 2018 court ruling, states can now collect sales tax on purchase through Amazon or other online retailers, regardless of whether those retailers have a physical presence locally. That's a silver lining. Without the Supreme Court intervention in the last 3 years, this would have been a whole different ballgame for us, Mr. Suthers said. Orlando, Florida is projected to suffer about as much as Colorado Springs in these estimates, but with the county responsible for many services, the Orlando municipal government will be spared the worst of the pain. Orlando City Hall's revenues rely heavily on property taxes, which were already set to grow next year. And like Colorado Springs, the Orlando area has been long benefited from population growth and a construction boom. The other side of broad demographic shifts toward the Sun Belt that have left northeastern cities like Rochester more vulnerable. Probably the property boom because of Disney. I wonder how that's affecting things. I digress. Maybe Orlando isn't the same dire situation as other places, said Collins, the city's chief financial officer, but he too is calling for direct federal aid, as is Mr. Suthers, a Republican mayor. This is really, really important for the long-term health of cities and states, Mr. McCullough said. At risk is not just services for local residents in any given city, but possibly disparities widening between cities that can weather the crisis and those that can't, if they are largely left on their own. One legacy of the Great Recession was exposing and increasing inequities between communities, said Amanda Cass, Associate Director of the Government Finance Research Center at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Now those disparities could grow even wider. It's a lot of comments that came in. I kind of read through the article pretty quick. It's got a little advertisement there just to scroll through, but it's got some good information here. Worth your time to look at it and reading through it, and maybe click on some of the links. If this video has been any value to you, please subscribe, leave some comments. Be safe, do things differently, and until my next video, I'm out.